1878, the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railroad steamed across the American plains into the U.S. territory of New Mexico. Settled in 1598, New Mexico was the largest and oldest Spanish settlement in the Southwest, and where the culture of Latinos remained strong.
The institutions of the society were deep in New Mexico. There was a deeply rooted insistence on maintaining the Spanish language, Spanish cultural traditions, Spanish religious traditions.
In the 30 years since the end of the Mexican-American War, the Hispano elite in New Mexico had preserved much of its economic and political standing, even as Californios and Tejanos had been overwhelmed by American expansion.
New Mexico is, in a sense, spared the violence of Texas and of California because it's a desert. I mean, there's basically nothing there that these new settlers, these incoming Anglo settlers want.
There's so many more Mexican Americans in New Mexico than there were in California or in Texas at the dawn of the U.S. Mexico War. These are communities that are bigger, that are settled, that have been there longer, and that really made a difference.
There were families that were land-holding families who sent their children off to school at Harvard, in St. Louis, in the Midwest, and who came back literate in English and literate in Spanish, who took their place and had leadership positions.
Miguel Antonio Otero, a wealthy Hispano, had studied law at St. Louis University. Elected delegate to the U.S. Congress, Otero was instrumental in bringing the railroad into northern New Mexico. For Otero and the New Mexican elites, the railroad brought economic progress, connecting the territory to Kansas and Chicago. But for many Nuevo Mexicanos, it was a threat.
In other places, only gentry had land. But in New Mexico, the lands that were not privately held were held in common, and they were open. They were open to be used by whomever.
With the railroad came Anglo cattle ranchers, and with the ranchers came barbed wire that now cut through lands held in common by Nuevo Mexicanos.
There's a saying in Spanish, con el alambre vino el hambre. With barbed wire came hunger, because the lands that had been used to graze animals and to raise crops were fenced off.
When people came to realize that they were losing their lands, they fought back.
Three brothers, Pablo, Nicanor, and Juan Jose Herrera, organized a resistance movement to protect 500,000 acres of land from encroachment by cattle ranchers. They wore hoods to mask their identity and called themselves Las Gorras Blancas, the white caps.
The Gorras Blancas may have been as large as 1,100 men. They don't hesitate to take matters into their own hand and to defend their rights with a gun.
Riding by moonlight, they tore up track, burned railroad bridges and barns, cut miles of barbed wire.
My great-grandfather had to leave his home community and move upstream to Las Vegas on the Santa Fe Trail because his lands had been expropriated by Anglo-American occupiers. And though there are no stories in the family about them resisting that, the likelihood is that they were part of the fence cutters and the barn burners.
Letters from ranchers complaining about the outrages of fence cutters in San Miguel County rained on the governor of the U.S. territory of New Mexico. Crimes were being committed, and the community as a whole has little or no protection, wrote County Clerk Miguel Antonio Otero, son of the man who brought the railroad to New Mexico. But others blamed the violence on the greed of land grabbers. When in November 1889, the Herrera brothers and 44 other so-called fence cutters were arrested, the local newspaper noted, "It will be a very difficult matter to obtain a jury who can be persuaded to punish their fellow citizens for acts, though illegal, they in their own hearts feel to be right." The charges against Las Gorras Blancas were dismissed. They disbanded in 1891. The fencing at San Miguel County stopped. But in a matter of decades, only a few thousand acres remained of the half-million-acre Las Vegas land grant.
Every family in New Mexico has a story about, oh, we used to own a lot of land. Well, what happened to that land? Well, we don't own it anymore. Well, what happened to it? Well, we don't know. It was lost somehow.
Las Gorras Blancas could not protect the lands of Nuevo Mexicanos, but they made history in a different way, helping to set a precedent of Latino resistance to injustice. Nuevo Mexicanos continued to fight for their rights as American citizens in a conquered territory. County Clerk Miguel Antonio Otero was appointed governor by U.S. President William McKinley and served for 2 terms. The leader of Las Gorras Blancas, Juan Jose Herrera, traded his white cap for a vested suit and was elected probate judge of San Miguel County.
New Mexico is unique among all the southwestern United States in having substantial political participation on the part of the Hispanic people.
Well into the 20th century, people of Mexican ancestry continue to be the numerical majority in New Mexico. And because they are the majority, they have a very different experience than, say, the Tejanos or the Californios.
In Sonoma, California, on a small estate he called Lacrima Montis, Tears of the Mountain, Mariano Vallejo spent his waning years. Stripped of his influence and fortune, he made a modest living selling water from a reservoir behind his home. Vallejo died in 1890 after completing a 5-volume history to uphold the legacy of Californios and his own place as one of California's founding fathers. The survivor of El Alamo, Juan Seguin, retired to Mexico where he died, forgotten, in 1890. 80 years later, his remains were brought to Texas and buried with honors. In his memoirs, Seguin called himself a foreigner in my own land and spoke for tens of thousands of Latinos, now second-class citizens, in a land that had once been theirs.